Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be talking about the LA wildfires.
Yes.
Um, those devastating fires that just ripped through LA, and uh, we've got a collection of BBC articles to
Right.
talk about the fires and the science of climate change, even global efforts like the Paris Agreement to try to combat it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really jumped out at me is this idea of atmospheric whiplash,
Right.
and how it can actually make floods and fires
Yes.
more likely, which sounds kind of crazy.
Yeah, it is a bit of a head scratcher.
It is.
But when you look at the science behind it,
Yeah.
it actually makes a lot of sense.
Okay, well, let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
I guess, can you just kind of paint a picture of what's happening in LA right now?
Well, the situation is really quite dire. I mean, at least 5 lives have been lost, and hundreds of buildings have been destroyed. Over 179,000 people have had to evacuate their homes.
Oh, wow.
And the BBC articles describe these eerie Martian orange skies over LA. From all the smoke and the ash, it's a really stark visual reminder of just how destructive these fires are.
Absolutely apocalyptic sounding. So let's get into this whiplash effect.
Okay.
What exactly is it, and how is it connected to what we're seeing with these fires?
So imagine this California's weather. It's basically on this wild seesaw swinging back and forth between really wet and really dry periods.
Okay.
Now, in 2022 and 2023, they had these massive amounts of rain after, decades of drought.
Right.
And all that rain led to just this huge boom in vegetation growth. But then this last autumn and winter in 2024,
Yeah.
it was bone dry. And it just turned all that lush new growth into perfect tinder for wildfires.
So it went from like super wet to super dry just like that.
Exactly. And that's the whiplash effect.
Okay, so where does climate change fit into all of this?
Well, the BBC articles cite some research showing that these whiplash events, these rapid shifts between wet and dry extremes, they're actually becoming more common and more intense all across the globe. Yeah, and since the middle of the 20th century, they've actually jumped by a crazy 31 to 66%.
Wow. That's a lot.
It's a big increase.
Yeah, so what's causing that huge increase though?
It basically comes down to a warmer atmosphere.
Okay.
As temperatures rise, the atmosphere can hold more moisture.
Okay.
Think of it like a giant sponge. When it's warm, it soaks up more water during those wet periods.
Okay.
But then when things start to dry out, the sponge gets wrung out even harder,
Oh.
leading to these much more intense dry spells.
Oh, so it just makes both extremes even more extreme.
Exactly. It amplifies both of them, creating that whiplash effect.
So basically, a warmer planet just messes with the whole water cycle, making these swings even crazier.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And that's what we're seeing playing out in California right now.
It's a major factor.
So it's kind of scary to think climate change is messing with the weather like that.
And it's not just limited to California. The BBC also points out that climate change is increasing what scientists call fire weather days.
Fire weather days.
Yeah, these are days with conditions like low humidity and high temperatures and strong winds that make fires much more likely to start and spread really quickly.
So it's like a double whammy. Then you have the
Yeah.
whiplash effect, creating all that dry brush.
Yeah.
And then you've got climate change making the perfect conditions for it to ignite.
Exactly. It's a
Wow.
recipe for disaster.
So the BBC articles also mentioned that LA's geography and vegetation kind of play into all of this as well.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
So LA is naturally prone to wildfires. I mean, it's got all this dry, flammable vegetation like chaparral.
Yeah.
And the terrain is very steep and mountainous, which allows fires to spread quickly uphill,
Right.
especially when you add wind into the mix.
So you've got climate change creating the conditions for more frequent and intense fires.
Right.
And then you've got LA's natural landscape making it even worse.
It's a dangerous combination.
It's a scary thought.
Mm-hmm.
And it really highlights how interconnected all of these issues are.
Absolutely. And if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, these LA fires are a stark reminder of what climate scientists have been warning us about for decades.
Yeah.
The more we mess with the climate system, the more we're going to see these kinds of extreme weather events.
Right.
And it's not just wildfires. We're talking hurricanes, floods, droughts, all sorts of things impacting communities all over the world.
Right. And that brings us to the Paris Agreement, this global effort to try to, mitigate these effects.
Yeah,
Maybe we can talk about that a little bit next.
definitely. That's a big one.
Yeah, yeah.
The Paris Agreement is a pretty incredible thing when you think about it. Nearly 200 countries all agreeing to work together to try to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. with
Wow.
an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees.
Compared to pre-industrial levels.
Exactly.
So why are those targets so important? And
Yeah.
what makes every fraction of a degree such a big deal?
Well, the science is very clear. Even small increases in global temperatures can trigger all sorts of changes like more frequent and intense heat waves,
Right.
rising sea levels, disruptions to ecosystems, and of course the extreme weather events we were just talking about, like that whiplash effect.
So those targets aren't just some random numbers. They're based on,
Yeah.
the science of how the planet works.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And exceeding those temperature thresholds could have some really serious, irreversible consequences for both humans and the natural world.
But the BBC articles kind of paint a bit of a gloomy picture in terms of how we're doing so far.
Yeah.
So what's the reality check here?
So the commitments made in the Paris Agreement are a step in the right direction, but the current plans that countries have put forward aren't really enough to meet those targets.
Oh.
Projections show that we're actually on track for a 2.6 to 2.8 degrees Celsius increase by 2100,
Wow.
which is obviously a lot higher than that 1.5 degree goal.
Yeah. So it seems like we have this agreement and everyone kind of understands the problem.
Yeah.
But the actions aren't matching the urgency of the situation.
It definitely highlights a gap between aspiration and reality,
Yeah.
and raises some big questions about how we bridge that gap. How do we turn these global commitments into actual tangible actions that will make a difference?
And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. It
Yeah.
can feel kind of overwhelming. Like, what can we as individuals really do besides, the everyday things like trying to reduce our energy consumption or eating less meat?
Those individual actions are definitely important. They all add up and they send a message. But beyond that, there's also a lot of power in collective action.
So what does that look like?
It could mean getting involved in local politics, pushing for stronger climate policies,
Right.
supporting organizations that are working on climate solutions, even just talking to friends and family who maybe aren't as engaged with these issues.
Right. So using our voices and our collective influence to try to create change.
Exactly. It's about pushing for systemic change, not just individual change.
Okay. And the BBC articles also mention this thing called climate finance.
Right.
Can you remind us what that is and why it's so important?
So climate finance is basically the money that's needed to help developing countries address climate change.
Okay.
This includes things like funding for mitigation efforts like switching to clean energy,
Yeah.
as well as adaptation measures like building seawalls or developing drought-resistant crops.
Right. And why is it important for wealthier countries to contribute to this?
Well, developing countries have contributed the least to historical greenhouse gas emissions, but they're often the ones most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
Right.
And they don't necessarily have the resources to cope with those challenges.
Yeah, we talked earlier about how that initial goal of $100 billion annually from wealthier nations wasn't even met until recently, and now there are calls for even more funding.
Yeah, the needs are massive, and the current commitments are really just not enough.
Wow. So it sounds like there's a lot of work to be done on that front, both in terms of getting those financial commitments up and making sure the money is being used effectively.
Absolutely. And it's really important for people in wealthier nations to hold their governments accountable for meeting those obligations.
Right.
Climate justice is a crucial part of climate action.
Yeah, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the urgency of the climate crisis, the importance of global agreements like the Paris Agreement, the power of individual and collective action, and this whole idea of climate finance.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation.
It has.
hmm
But I'm curious, what do you think is the most important takeaway from all of this?
For me, I think it's a reminder that while the challenges are huge, we're not powerless. We have the ability to make choices both in our own lives and as a society that can make a difference. And even though the science can feel scary, it also empowers us with knowledge. The more we understand about climate change, the better equipped we are to find solutions.
I love that perspective. It's not about giving up. It's about taking action.
Exactly. Hope is not passive hope. It's fueled by knowledge, by action, by a belief in our collective ability to create a better future.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've explored the science, the global agreements, even touched on some potential solutions. But I want to bring it back to that image we talked about earlier of those orange Mars-like skies over Los Angeles.
Yeah.
What does that image make you think about?
It's a stark visual reminder that the consequences of climate change are real. They're happening now.
Yeah.
And they're impacting real people's lives in profound ways.
It's easy to get lost in the data and the policy debates, but that image really brings it home.
Yeah.
It reminds us that there's a human story at the heart of all this.
Yeah, it really does make you think about the people, the families who had to flee their homes, the firefighters on the front lines, the communities trying to rebuild.
Right, and it's so important to remember that, these aren't just statistics or data points. We're talking about real people, real communities with their own stories of loss and resilience. One of the articles I read talked about people grabbing just a few belongings and fleeing as they watched their whole neighborhood go up in flames.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. It really highlights the human cost of these disasters.
And it underscores the connection between climate change and social justice. Too often, the communities hit hardest by these events are the ones with the fewest resources to cope.
Right. It's often those who have contributed the least to the problem who end up suffering the most.
Exactly. And that's why climate action needs to be approached through a lens of equity and justice, making sure solutions are inclusive and really address the needs of those most vulnerable to a changing climate.
So it's not just about reducing emissions. It's about creating a more resilient world for everyone. A world where communities are better prepared to face these challenges no matter what their socioeconomic status is.
Yeah, it's about rethinking our systems and structures. Climate change forces us to confront the flaws in a system that prioritizes short-term profit over long-term sustainability and perpetuates inequalities that make certain communities much more vulnerable to climate risks.
It's like climate change is holding up a mirror to society, showing us all the things we need to fix.
It's a wake-up call for sure, urging us to think bigger and bolder about the solutions.
So where do we go from here amidst all this doom and gloom? Is there any hope?
I think there is. I think the hope lies in our ability to learn from these crises, to adapt, to innovate, and to build a more sustainable and just future the LA fires, while tragic, also provide valuable lessons about urban planning, forest management, and community resilience.
So even in these terrible events, there are opportunities for growth and change.
Absolutely. It's about shifting our perspective from despair to empowerment. We're not passive victims in all of this. We have the power to make different choices, to advocate for change, and create a world where those orange skies become a distant memory.
I love that it's not about giving up. It's about channeling our energy and our creativity towards a better future.
Exactly. It's about harnessing the power of human innovation, collaboration, and compassion to tackle this challenge.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. We've explored the science, the global agreements, the power of individual and collective action, and the urgent need for climate justice.
It's been a great conversation.
It really has. To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the LA fires and the broader climate crisis. We hope this conversation has inspired you to learn more and to take action.
Remember, every action, no matter how small, can make a difference.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. The future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create together. So let's go out there and create a future where clean air, healthy ecosystems, and resilient communities are the norm, not the exception. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep taking action.